This is the Mumfre Files, and today we're going to discuss the Axeman of New Orleans. Before we examine anything, I want to tell you what I think is wrong with how this case has been told for the last 100 years or more. 4 things stand out. 1, the most famous piece of evidence in this case, the letter is a hoax. Yes, I said that, a hoax. The man who came through those doors did not write this letter. I will explain my position and show you. 2, they have been told he crawled through a hole in the door. It's ridiculous. He did not do that. The crime scene says something else entirely. And what it says tells you what he did for a living before he was labeled the Axeman. 3, there are people who will tell you this is the same man who did the Villisca, Iowa murders. It's not. I could show you why using the crime scenes themselves. You're going to learn. 4, 2 innocent men went to prison for one of these murders. Nobody framed them. The people working it decided who they liked and then went looking for somebody who conveniently fit their file. That is the same habit that let the man who actually did this walk away. Because while they were working on a witness, nobody was reading the scene. And I am going to show you it happened 4 separate times. So how am I going to do all this? That's a fair question. But not with the theory, with the crime scenes themselves. There are 2 things you have to understand first. Everything a man does at a crime scene can be one of 2 things. The first is what he had to do. The second is what he couldn't stop himself from doing. One of those is why these 2 cases are in the same file. The other is why they shouldn't be. Yes, we are talking about MO and signature. Hold on to that for now, because by the end of this, you and I will answer the question people have been arguing about for a century. All right, let's go to work on this together. On the 16th of March, 1919, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, which is their newspaper, printed a letter. Now, this letter came from a man who had been coming through back doors with an axe for the better part of the year within the city. He wrote that they had never caught him, and they never would. He wrote that they had never seen him because he was invisible as the ether that surrounds the earth. Okay? That's what he said. Now, he also said he wasn't a human being, that he was a spirit and a demon out of the hottest parts of hell. And when he saw fit, he would come and claim other victims, and he alone knew who they would be. Now, he named the night Tuesday, 15 minutes past midnight, earthly time, and he made the city an offer. Every house where a jazz band was playing would be passed over. It's almost like a biblical times reference here. Now, the night of March 18th, 1919, almost midnight, and there's not a silent house left in New Orleans. The dance halls are full to the walls. Nobody's able to dance. Bands are booked out weeks ahead in a single afternoon. In houses that cannot afford a band, somebody's daughter is at the piano and she is playing all night long. Where there is no piano, there is a phonograph, and the phonograph runs all night long. The men are sitting up in the front room with a shotgun across their knees while the wives play ragtime in the parlor behind them. A whole city terrified, playing music into the dark so that a monster will not come inside. Then the sun comes up and nobody had been touched. The letter is the most famous piece of evidence in this case. It is the reason 107 years later you still know the name, the Axeman of New Orleans. It is also the first thing I would have tagged as evidence to be examined. Prints, writing analysis, etc. I will come back to the letter, and I'm going to take it apart line by line because I think it is a hoax, and I can show you why. But not yet. Before we ask who wrote that letter, we have to be willing to ask the tough questions. You have to ask, who wanted that letter print? Was there something to be gained by having this letter printed? Now, I have to pivot first. This is important. We will come back to that letter. I want to take you into a house in Iowa 7 years earlier, because you cannot understand what happened in New Orleans until you understand a crime scene. And basically how to look for rituals, signatures in MO. I want to walk you through this scene. Villisca, Iowa, June the 9th, 1912. A town where nobody locks the door because there's not a reason to lock the door. The Moore family comes home from church on Sunday night, Josiah and Sarah and their 4 children. 2 girls are staying over, Ina and Lena Stillinger, 12 and 8 years old. Now, these girls are spending the night as house guests. 8 people go to sleep for the night in that house. In the morning, all 8 of them are dead. Every one of them killed in their beds with an axe that belonged to Josiah. The axe was in the woodpile outside in the yard. Whoever came into that house used it and left it on the floor of the downstairs bedroom. No sounds were heard loud enough to wake a neighbor, and nobody heard a thing. And then he did something that has never made sense to anybody who has looked at this since. He covered every mirror in that house. He draped cloth over the mirrors, covering the glass. He covered the 2 windows that had no curtains on them. He covered the faces of the people that he had killed, and then he stayed in the house. He was in that house for hours, and everybody in it was dead. We know that because of what he ate, and what he moved, and what he washed. Here's what was found in the house when the investigators searched it. Slab of raw bacon on the floor of the downstairs bedroom next to the axe. A lamp in the room where the bodies were, with the glass chimney taken off and the wick turned down as low as it would go and still burn, a very low light. He wanted to see what he was doing, but he didn't want to be seen from outside, especially by someone who might have passed by the house at night in the hours he was doing his work. And a piece of the keychain on the floor that did not belong to anybody who lived in that house. Side note, it is important that you know the difference between MO and signature. What is an MO? Basically, his working method. Take the axe. That is a weapon of opportunity. He didn't bring one with him. But think about what that actually requires of him. He is coming at night, in the dark, to a house he does not live in. And he already knows where the axe is. That is not luck. That is a man who has been on that property before, perhaps during late daylight, and located it. Now, signature. Turning the axe to the blunt side after the first kill, covering the mirrors using the sheets, covering the faces, the lamp chimney off, the bacon, and wash it. That's beyond what was needed to commit the crime. It stays and it identifies him. Why, you may ask? Because it is a psychological need rather than a necessity. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is the part that bugs me about this case more than any other fact. The police or someone should have secured the house and controlled who entered and left. It's common sense in any era of crime scene investigation. Nobody secured that house. By the middle of the day, the record says basically 100 people have walked through the house, viewing each room. Neighbors, townspeople, people who wanted to see it, maybe even our suspect. They walked past the bacon, they walked past the axe, they walked past the lamp in the chimney with the chimney off. Did one of them drop the keychain, or does it belong to our killer? Whatever that scene had to tell you, it told you that morning before the crowd showed up. and there was nobody in that house qualified to examine it and observe the clues. I worked many cases. I can tell you what 100 people do to one. We called it evidence eradication. Every one of them leaves something behind and takes something with them. Now, the mirrors and the faces. In 1912, covering a mirror was not strange. Covering the mirrors in a house where somebody had died was practiced in this country by a lot of folks, including in Iowa. When President Lincoln lay in state, they draped the mirror frames in the East Room and covered the glass itself. And down south, it lasted a lot longer than it did with the folks up north. Okay, the Park Service has sat down and recorded people out of the Cane River region in Louisiana describing that exact practice inside living memory, meaning it was passed down generation to generation. It came over from Europe, to be honest with you. I want to be clear about this practice because it matters. Those folks do not all agree. Some covered the glass for a death in the room. Some covered it when the lightning came. The custom was real and it was local, but it wasn't uniform. Where it was practiced, the reasoning and the belief ran like this. A spirit that has just come out of the body is still in the room. It is confused. It does not know yet that they have passed. If the spirit catches its own reflection in the glass, it can be held there. Or it reaches out and takes the next living person who looks into that mirror. So that is why they covered them, all of them. Do not let the spirit of the dead see themselves, and you do not let anybody else see them either. Whoever was in that house knew this, knew it well enough to follow this practice. He did this practice just like any other grieving family who follows this ritual and is preparing a wake or viewing for the next morning. He did this that night with his own hands before anybody else got the chance to walk into that house. He pulled the sheets over their faces the way an undertaker preps a body for viewing. He covered every mirror in that house like he was setting his own private wake. Now, I want to be clear about what that does and does not get him. The man decides how he gets in. He decides what he picks up and what he leaves. He decides when to go. He does not decide this. This is the part that comes out of him, whether he wants it to or not. Every minute he spent covering those mirrors was a minute he was standing in a house with 8 dead bodies in it, and no good reason to still be there. It didn't get him away clean. It didn't get him away faster. It got him nothing. He did it anyway. That's not a choice, folks. That's a need. There's a ritual, and he has to do it. Did you hear me? He had to do it. There are 2 ways to read that, and they do not point at the same man. The first is knowledge and nerve, somebody who has stood in a room where that ritual actually happened. Okay? Setting and sitting with a body. Worked around the dead for a living. A man reproducing something he had watched done right and remained calm enough to do it with 8 bodies still in the house with him. The second reading is worse, and I cannot rule this one out. The practice was not etiquette to him or the dead, but more about a belief, a claim about something real, and that was basically still in the room with him, a spirit just out of the body, confused, reaching for whoever looks into the glass next. If he believed that, actually believed it, then covering those mirrors was never a courtesy he paid to a family he had just destroyed. It was him protecting himself from them. And here's what makes me question his process with this practice, I should say. If all he wanted was a house that looked properly in mourning, covering the mirrors and windows do that job all on their own. He never had to touch those bodies, but he pulled the sheets over every face, and that is not part of the mirror custom, but covering the windows is. It is meant to keep spirits out while the bodies were being prepared, as well as keeping the room cooler while they're preparing. This suspect may have had a fear of spirits aimed at a second target, himself, based on the scene. He covered the glass and he covered their eyes for the same reason. He did not want anything left in that house looking at him. Cannot prove which man he was from the evidence in the room, but either way, the control he displayed still holds. It only changes what the control was protecting, not getting away clean, getting away from them, meaning the spirits. One more thing before we go, and it is the one that should bother you. Nobody walks into their first kill and runs a house like that. Total silence, total control, 8 people, and the presence of mind to stage a wake afterward. That gets learned somewhere, folks, which means Villisca was not the beginning of anything. It was somewhere in the middle. So what did the investigators do with all that? Nothing. They did nothing. 4 years later, with the case stone cold, the county brings in a private detective named Wilkerson. He does not start with the scene, he starts with the name. A local man who had a business dispute with Josiah, and then he goes looking for facts to basically fit his belief. He tours the county, giving public talks to anyone who would listen, laying out a case he has not proven. He only has hearsay and no physical evidence. He gets a man arrested whose payroll records put him working several hundred miles away that night. Records are evidence. The grand jury will not indict, so he forces the second one, which clears his original target, and then indicts a traveling preacher as an afterthought. 2 trials, a hung jury, and then an acquittal. Not one piece of evidence. The axe, the silence, the lamp, the mirrors, the food left out, the keychain, the stage wig. None of that. That is what I mean when I say a case gets decided on what people say instead of what the scene showed. Hold that, because 6 years later, in 1,000 miles south, it is going to happen again. And this time, it does cost 2 innocent men their freedom. Now, on May the 23rd, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Italian grocers, were asleep in the rooms above their own store. Somebody comes through a rear door in the dark, cuts both their throats with a straight razor, and finishes with an axe. The axe belonged to the house, and whoever did this, had changed out of his bloody clothes. The reason why we know that, because they were found at the scene. Whoever did this took nothing, cash and jewelry, sitting in plain sight, untouched. Outside, on the sidewalk near the house, somebody had written a message about a Mrs. Maggio sitting up that night. It was written with chalk on the sidewalk. That's what the paper said. Nobody has ever explained it, so here goes. Possibly it's a hidden meaning to a wake, but it was discovered a block from the store by Detective Theodore Obitz, New Orleans PD, after the bodies were found during a canvass that day. Detective Obitz unfortunately was shot and killed 4 days later by a man he just took into custody. Now, he is the only person who is documented as seeing that chalked note with his own eyes. The papers carried versions of this note, but none of the reporters on record actually saw it, meaning it was a guess at what was written on the sidewalk and cleaned up for print 2 days after the fact. Over the next 17 months, the killings happen again, or the attacks, and again and again. June, Louise Bozermer and Harriet Lowe in the back of Bozermer's grocery, both struck in the head. She never recovers. August, Anna Schneider, heavily pregnant, wakes to a shape standing over the bed. She lives, so lives her baby. Weeks later, the Romano household. March 1919, the Cordamillas in Gretna, across the river from New Orleans. Now we're going to spend some real time there. But first, August, Steve Boca, a grocer, wakes with his skull split and walks himself across the street to a neighbor's door. September, Sarah Lauman, 19 years old, living alone. October, Mike Pepitone, beaten to death in his own bed with his wife in the room. And then it stops. Now that was the list. There are 4 things worth repeating every time. Entry starts with a panel chiseled out of the back door, quiet enough that people sleeping 10 feet away do not wake up. The weapon is already inside the house, the axe or whatever they're going to use. Nothing is ever stolen and the victims are always asleep. Take those one at a time because each one narrows in on who and what we are dealing with. The door panel is the most useful thing on this list, and it is the one everybody gets wrong. A century of retelling has him crawling through that hole like something out of a nightmare. Look at the scene. Remember? Look at the scene. The panels came out small, cut low beside the lock, and the chisel got left on the floor inside. Nobody crawled through anything. He cuts the hole, reaches through, works the lock, and opens the door like he owns the place. That is not brute force. That, my friends, is a burglar's trade. Craft, basically. That is a man on his knees on somebody's back step in the middle of the night, working a chisel. Think about that. Into a door panel, slow and quiet. For however long it takes, with the whole street behind him. Okay? And a man does not cut his first door this clean. That kind of quiet is a skill, and a skill has a history. He had been opening other people's doors for years before anybody ever died behind one. Whatever else the Axeman was, he was a burglar first, no doubt about it. And think about the nerve that takes. Not the violence, the waiting, the patience. The borrowed weapon means he walks up carrying nothing. If a patrolman stops him on the way, he is a man out for a walk. That is not luck. That is a man who has already thought about being stopped or was stopped in the past and adjusted his MO. Also, he took nothing. No theft kills an entire category. This kills an entire category of motive. Takes nothing. He walked past the money to get to people. Whatever he came for was not in the cash drawer. And then there is the victim selection, which is the part that actually puts a shape on him. Overwhelmingly Italian immigrant, grocery families, a specific trade, a specific community, a specific set of addresses. Random does not look like that. Random scatters. This is a list that somebody had to already know what was on it. So before we go anywhere near a name, I am going to tell you what those 17 months hand you. And I'm going to be careful about how I do it. So before we go anywhere near a name, here's what those 17 months give you. And I really want to be careful about how I do this. Look, the FBI did not have a unit for this work until the 70s. You had Douglas, Wrestler, Quantico, all of it 50 years after this file went cold. Remember, this is a cold case. So, I'm not going to tell you what a computer would say. I am going to give you what the scenes support. Then, I'm going to give you what I'm inferring on top of that. Then what I cannot know. That's the order. And that's the way it's supposed to be done. All right? So here is his profile. An adult male. He's local. He knows which grocers, which back lots, which rooms they sleep in, and in 1919, you learn that by living there. A burglar before he was anything else. That panel work on the doors, that's a trade. Doors had been opening for this man for years before anyone died behind one. Patient enough to case a house before he ever opens the door. He walks up carrying nothing. He leaves the weapon in the house. That is a man who has already thought about being stopped on the street or was stopped in the past. Indifferent to anything in that house worth money. He walked past cash and jewelry every single time. Whatever he came for was never in the cash drawer. And at the Maggio house, he changed out of his bloody clothes and left them on the floor. He came expecting blood, and he had planned for it. Now, what I am inferring, hands, a trade with tools in it. That chisel work is quiet and it's clean, and quiet hands get earned somewhere. Nobody counts his nights, meaning he either lives alone or he lives in a house where a man coming in at 4 in the morning is not a conversation. He has a record for property, not for people. And that city, and if that city ever had him under arrest, it'd be for a lesser crime, perhaps theft or burglary. And he is unremarkable. 17 months, not one fight, not one confrontation. Nobody on the street was afraid of him because there was nothing about him to be afraid of. Now, what I cannot know, his age. He is past old enough to be good at it. Whether he was of that community or just worked it, I don't know. Whether he could read what the papers were saying about him and what he wanted, which is the only question anybody actually cares about. I can tell you what it was not. It was not about money, and it was not rage. He left too many of them breathing for rage. And then there is why it stops. Men like this stop for 4 reasons. They either die, they go to prison or something else, they move, or their health takes their ability to continue a life of crime. Now, nobody ever ran that list against a single name. Just think if they did. You can imagine it might have got some suspect list. And if I had him across the table, this is how you get him to open up. I would not start with the murders. Not one question about them. You're probably wondering why I say that. I would ask him about the doors, because a man like this is not proud of what he did in those rooms. His pride and craft is how quietly he got in the house. A man will lie all night about what he did. They never lie about how good he was at it. This is the way in. Once the door is open, no pun intended, you stick your foot in and don't let him close it. He'll talk. Now that's the profile. Everything from here gets tested against it, not the other way around, which is precisely the mistake we are about to watch 2 police departments make. No crime scene analysis to rule out suspects or to add suspects. Nope. So, let's go across the river. Gretna, Louisiana, across the river from New Orleans. Now, different parish, different police department. That last part is going to matter more than it sounds like it should. Okay, it's just going to. Charlie Cordemelia, a grocer, his wife, Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, are asleep in the same bed. Somebody comes through the back door with an axe and uses it. Mary does not survive. Charlie and Rosie survive the attack, but their skulls are fractured. Got hit with an axe. Orlando Giordano, the grocer from next door, hears screaming coming from his neighbor's house. He runs across the street and finds Rosie standing in the doorway with a split head holding her dead child, Mary. Folks, you gotta look at the scene. Panel out of the back door, axe already on the property, nothing taken. Italian grocery family. New Orleans PD would look at the scene and see their suspect. Gretna PD looked at the scene, saw something else entirely. Why don't they communicate? I don't know, jurisdictional boundaries, grudge matches, the whole thing's a crying shame. Now, these 2 men next door, are they patsies or convenience? Like the Cordemelia family, Orlando Giordano and his son Frank were Italian grocers with their stores located on the same block. And here's the part that matters. Those 2 families had been business partners. By 1919, they were not partners, they were competitors. And the Cordemelias had recently taken the Giordanos to court over it. So there it is, a soured partnership, a competing store in the same block, and a lawsuit on the record. This is motive sitting right there, already written down before anybody gets hurt. And they are the ones who ran toward the screaming. They are the ones who sent for help. 3 weeks later, both of these men were under arrest for the murder of Mary. What did the PD have? Okay, there's no physical evidence, none. Not a print, not a weapon, not a witness, not one thing that put either of those men inside that house. What Gretna had was a motive they liked and two men standing conveniently close to it. Chief Peter Lesson and Sheriff Louis Marajo settled on the neighbors, and that was the end of their investigation. Here's how they did it. They went and got themselves an identification. That's what they did. Now, picture the scene, Charity Hospital. Rosie Cordemelia was in Charity Hospital with a fractured skull, and her 2-year-old was in the ground. Since Charlie did not want to be involved in the investigation, the investigators came at Rosie over and over the same question. Who hit you? Was it the Giordano's? It was Frank, wasn't it? According to the doctor treating her, she gave them the same answer every time. She did not know. She never saw who it was. When she was well enough to be discharged, they didn't let her go. They didn't let her go home to grieve her daughter. Moreo arrested her as a material witness and put her in the Gretna jail. She got out when she had signed a statement naming the two men next door. She could not read English. The statement was written for her in English. The statement was the entire case. There was nothing else in it. Her own physician said an identification from her was not worth anything, that it was not reliable because of the head injury, and who knows what else. Her child was dead. There had to be a lot of stress on her. The jury convicted in under a week. Orlando Giordano got life. Frank Giordano was 17 years old, and they sentenced him to hang. Now, I want to slow all the way down here because none of this had to happen. And that is what makes it worth an hour of your time. Start with the physical facts, which, as far as anybody can tell, nobody at either PD or courthouse ever weighed. The man who did this opened the back door the Axeman's way. The panel chiseled out beside the lock, a hand through the hole, the bolt turned from the inside. Now, here's the thing. Frank Giordano was over 6 feet tall and better than 200 pounds. Orlando was pushing 70 years old. Everybody who argues about this case argues over whether a man Frank's size could fit through that hole. That is the wrong argument because nobody came through the hole. It was cut to reach the lock. Anybody who has a doggy door understands this. You have to be a small person, let alone stay quiet, crawl through it. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you an older man cannot swing an axe. Of course he can. But that is not the argument, and it is a weak one. Here is the argument. You have to ask it all at once. Could those two men chisel a panel out of a back door quietly enough that nobody inside that house woke up, got in like mice, cross a dark house in the middle of the night without putting a foot wrong, swing accurately in the dark and walk back out clean, no blood on their clothes, all of it same night without a sound? It takes a certain skill to open that door. That is a trade. That is the same practice entry work that had been repeated across the river for 10 months. That is a burglar's hand, and a grocer and his 17-year-old son do not have it. The scene excluded both of them before anybody ever took a statement. The door alone cleared them. Now let's look at that identification. Every single condition you would flag on a modern eyewitness case is stacked in that hospital room at once. An attack in the dark, head trauma to the witness, catastrophic grief, her daughter had just died, being isolated and placed in a jail like a criminal, repeated questioning that names the suspects out loud over and over until those names are the only living thing in the room, and then a signature on a document she could not read. That is not a witness remembering something. That is a witness being handed something and asked to hold on to it. And here's the part that gets missed every single time this case gets told. I do not think anybody in Gretna set out to frame two innocent men. However, they were just convenient. I have worked with those type of guys. I know what they felt in the room. They were certain they had a rivalry between two families. They had a feud in the court record. They had two men they had already settled on. And they could not see past them. Okay, that is my opinion. Okay, what it really is, not malice, it's poor police work, stubborn belief, wrong suspects, missed clues pointing at the profile, didn't look at the door. Maybe a bit of skipping processes or procedures to keep your case file closure rate low, probably. All wrong and all leads to disgusting outcomes. Wilkerson did it in Iowa with a grudge and a hunch. Gretna did it by using a business dispute as well, a grudge, right? Different state, different decade. Same results. 1920, Rosie took it all back, and she was not done being leaned on either. After the trial, she was threatened with perjury charges if she did not stick to her original story. She stuck to it for 9 months, and then in 1920, Rosie Cordemelia took it all back. And I want you to hear where she went to do it. Okay, she did not go to the police, did not trust them. She did not go to a lawyer. Courts are crooks too. She walked into the newspaper office, the Times-Picayune, the same paper that printed that letter a year earlier. She signed another affidavit. She said she had never seen the attackers. She said she had been pressured into naming the Jordanos. She said she had done it out of jealousy and spite over a business dispute, which is exactly what she had been telling the doctors in the first place before anybody put her in a cell. Now, there's one more thing that she said, and I'm going to give it to you exactly the way she gave it, and let you think on it a little bit. She said St. Joseph came to her in a dream and told her she had to tell the truth. Hold on to that, because St. Joseph is going to come up in this file one more time. It is not going to be a dream. Both convictions were vacated. Frank Giordano came off death row. Both men are carried today in the National Registry of Exonerations. You can find them there. Frank was 17 when they sentenced him to hang. He was 19 when he walked out. So here's where this file actually stands in Gretna. In 17 months of attacks, the only conviction this case ever produced was of two innocent men. The only identification anybody ever got was manufactured in a jail cell. And whoever came through that back door walked away clean because the investigation stopped looking the second it found somebody it liked. Not what the scene was saying. Hold that. Because in about 10 minutes, a widow in Los Angeles is going to stand over her body on her own front steps and tell you she knows exactly who he was. Now, side note, Charlie Cordemelia did testify in court. He told the court and the jury that it wasn't the Jordanos. Sad part about this is, after this trial, Charlie and Rosie divorced. Rosie was on her own, and when she went into that office, when she went into the mailroom of the newspaper to report or want to take her story back, she did it after the sheriff was chased out of office. Mind you, she didn't like the police. She also wasn't feeling well, and she had been arrested earlier that year. There's stories around that, and I'm not going to get into that, but she wanted to retract that story and basically set the record straight. So essentially what happened here is they were definitely victims of this murder and Axeman, but the police made that family victims too. And as law enforcement, we got to be better than that. So I just wanted to tie that loop in case anybody was wondering about Charlie. So he did stick to his story, and Rosie, she changed hers. But before we go any further, I have to correct something that I previously told you. I told you Rosie maintained her story for 9 months. That timeline's wrong. They convicted the Giordano's in May of 1919. Rosie walked into that newspaper office on December the 7th, 1920. That's a year and a half later. And I want to be clear about why I am stopping to fix that, because it's not just a number. 9 months sounds like somebody who cracked, like the pressure got to her, and she folded very quick. A year and a half is different. A year and a half means she held that lie through 2 winters while a 17-year-old boy sat on death row and his father sat in Angola. Horrible prison. Rosie finally broke herself. Nobody was leaning on her to tell the truth. Nobody. There was no reward in it for her. She had already gotten what she wanted, which was out of the cell. That is a woman who could not carry it anymore. And there's one more thing I owe you, because last time I paraphrased her, and I should not have done that. When she came into that newspaper office, she did not walk in calm and file a correction. By all accounts, she broke down. And what she said about herself was this: my baby is dead. My husband has left me. I have smallpox. That is the state's star witness a year and a half after they got what they needed out of her. Her daughter was dead. Charlie never forgave her for the testimony, and the marriage was over. And she was sick. That is what was left of the woman whose word put 2 men in Angola and a boy on death row. All right, let's move on to Los Angeles. Esther Pepitone left New Orleans after her husband Mike was beaten to death in their bedroom in October of 1919. That is the last attack anybody officially attaches to the Axeman. Esther moved to Los Angeles. She remarried to a man named Angelo Albano. 2 years later, Albano vanished. No body, no trace of him. He vanished on the anniversary of Mike Pepitone's murder. A man calling himself Leon Mumfre comes to her door. He wants $500 and her jewelry. He puts his hand on his hip pocket, indicating he had a gun, or wanted her to think he had one. Mumfre tells Esther that if she does not hand it over, he will kill her the same way he killed her husband. My question is, which husband? Now, she goes into her bedroom. She comes back with a revolver. This man's not too bright. The coroner's report filed under Mumfre's California alias says she shot him 8 times. Another count says 11, 3 of them in the back. He died on her front steps, which tells you the exact number was never nailed down. Not even at the level of an autopsy. That could not agree on how many times a woman shot a man on her own porch. I find it odd that an autopsy was completed, but there was no clear conclusion on the number of times Mumfre was shot. It's crazy. Now, I want to put something on the table, and then I want to be very careful about what I do with it. Her second husband disappeared on the anniversary of her first husband's murder. The body was never found. 2 months later, a man is standing on her porch telling her he killed her husband, and he wants $500 and her jewelry, and she kills him. If that set of facts came across my desk, I am not closing it as a robbery. I am asking a lot more questions than anybody asked in 1921. I want to know what happened to Angelo Albano. I want to know why a blackmailer travels 2,000 miles to knock on that particular door. I want to know what the $500 was for, because there are 2 ways to read a man saying, give me the money or I will kill you like I killed your husband. One of them is a threat. The other one's coming to collect a bill. And that is exactly where I stop. Because they do not have one thing that says which one it was. Not a document, not a witness, nothing. And I have spent this entire file telling you what happens when somebody looks at a suggestive set of facts and decides they have got it. Gretna had a feud and 2 men standing close by, and that was enough for them. It is not going to be enough for me. So, I'm not telling you Esther Pepitone did anything except shoot a man who came to her door and threatened her life. That is what the record says. She was never charged, and on what is written down, she should not have been, basically. I am telling you, there was a question sitting there in 1921, and nobody ever worked it or asked any questions. And they did not look that part, I will give them. And they did look that part up, I will give them that, okay? Los Angeles did investigate the shooting. I should say that. New Orleans opened up their own file off the back of it, and they went looking for what tied this man to the Axeman. What they found was circumstantial, a blackmail operation, a pattern of dates, and they closed it out and said the Axeman murders were still unsolved. Which, to the credit, is the honest answer. That is the one time in this whole file somebody had a suspect in front of them, could not prove it, and said out loud, instead of convicting somebody, that they're innocent. But nobody ever went and found Angela Albano's body. Now, I have to correct myself out loud again. That is twice in this show. Almost every version of this story, including the one I nearly used building this episode, has Esther telling police word for word that Mumfre was the Axeman, that she saw him run from her first husband's room on the night he was killed, that she believed he killed all those people. There's a hell of a line. It has been a retelling since the 1950s. It ends the story perfectly. I get it. I understand why everybody uses it. You cannot find it anywhere near a primary source. It traces back to popular true crime writers Robert Tallant in 1952 and the people who repeated him after that. Not a police report, not a transcript. And when a later researcher went back and actually looked, no police report and no court record from either city mentions that identification at all, ever. So which one do you want? The version that wraps 100 years up in a bow, or the hard one? That is the same trap this entire file is about, and I nearly walked into it myself on camera. So let's test Mumfre against the profile, all right? The specific profile off those crime scenes. We do not get to test Mumfre against the parts that feel good. We test them against all of the profile. Now, local and connected to community, he matches, without question. He ran a blackmail operation against Italian-American families in New Orleans, the exact community on that target list. And he already done time for bombing an Italian grocery store in 1907. This is a man inside the community working it with a documented taste for terrorizing it. Tool skill, very thin. His documented trades were a pharmacist, which explains the bombs, and labor agent. The experienced burglar read on the Axeman comes entirely off the crime scenes itself. The chisel, the door panel, that tells you what the Axeman could do. It tells you nothing about whether this man, Mumfre, could. Nobody has ever produced a record of him working a tool or getting into a house quietly. Travel, thin, empty, there's nothing there. If you want him on those rail lines, you need him somewhere on those rail tracks, okay? There's nothing. No record puts him outside New Orleans at any point before 1919. He surfaces on the West Coast only after, and nobody has ever documented how he got there. And then there's the timeline, which is the thing that makes him interesting in the first place. In jail, through the quiet stretches on the street for every killer. But a correlation is not evidence. It never has been. Nobody has ever put that man inside one of those houses, not once. And Miriam Davis, who went back and read the actual police documents, describes how this story got twisted in the retelling. From the Los Angeles police to the New Orleans police to the New Orleans reporters, like a game of telephone. By the time it reached print, it was a much better story than anything anybody could ever document. And this is where the popular story and the actual story split apart. The tidy version hands you one man, Joseph Mumfre. The trouble is nobody can find him in the records under the name. Richard Warner, working from primary sources, tried to solve that by unifying the aliases, arguing that the New Orleans grocery bomber and a man named Mumfre and the man Esther shot under the name Leon Mumfre were all one person tied to a mafia faction. Other careful researchers, Michael Newton and Miriam Davis, argue the opposite, that Mumfre is a composite stitched together out of a similar sounding names across two cities, and that it cannot be verified as a single man at all. So take your pick. One suspect the records cannot confirm, or a composite they cannot take apart. Either way, there's not one piece of physical evidence connecting either version of him to a single crime scene. No chisel, no axe, no forensic link, nothing. What there is a widow's memory of a shape running out of her husband's room, laid onto a man she already had a separate and entirely sufficient reason to want dead. She claimed he said she owed him money. He came to collect it, she shot him dead. Somebody comes to the door the way he does and asks for $500 and her jewelry. That does not sound like the Axeman, folks. All right, now we go back and get the letter. I'm going to take it apart as a document, not as a legend, because this letter is not a legend. It's a piece of paper that somebody sat down and wrote for a specific reason. First thing, the writing is educated. It reaches for Tartarus, that is the pit underneath the Greek underworld. It's not a word that turns up by accident. That is somebody who is well read. And that is not the vocabulary of the man in this file, okay? It's not the Axeman. That is not the man on his knees on a back step at 2 a.m. working a chisel into a door panel quietly. Now, Miriam Davis has done the serious work on this, argues that the letter was a hoax. Completely agree with her. And here's why. We're going to look at the profile. The profile really tells it. Look at every choice the Axeman makes. He takes nothing. He carries nothing. Carrying nothing in, basically, right? He picks houses where people are asleep. He gets in and back out without waking a neighbor on either side of the street. Every single decision he makes for 17 months is a decision to be less noticed. So think about that. A man who has spent 10 months making himself invisible does not write to the newspaper and announce a date. Now we go through it. I told you at the top, I think it is a hoax. I'm sure it's a hoax. I'm going to take it apart in front of you, and I'm going to do it the way I would do it on any case. Line by line. Right? Here we go. The writer is not reporting anything he did. He's building a character and asking a newspaper to run it. The last line of that letter before the signature reads, "Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee." This is the letter telling you what it is for. It wants to be printed. That is the objective. And look at the top of it. It is datelined, hell, March 13th, 1919, editor of the Times-Picayune, New Orleans. That is a newspaper format, place, date, addressed to the editor. Whoever wrote this wrote it in the shape of the thing he wanted it to become. Newspaper article. This is a being who cannot be caught, cannot be seen, and cannot be harmed. That is the whole claim. Then he writes this, "I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me." I don't think, I feel sure. That's hedging. There's a man qualifying his own statement. Something that is actually invisible does not think it is probably invisible. It's either invisible or it's not. And he contradicts himself inside one paragraph. Same paragraph about the police, 2 sentences apart. Here's the first one. They have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty. Then they're wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Stupid is what he started with, then wise. Same police, same paragraph, no time in between. A man who actually holds an opinion about the police holds the same one for at least 4 sentences. This writer does not have a position. He is generating sentences to fill a paragraph, and he lost track of what he said at the top of it. Count them in one short document. A spirit, a fell demon from the hottest hell, the Axeman, a reasonable spirit, a most horrible murderer, the worst spirit that ever existed. 6 different names for himself. That's a choice. Now, think about how you talk about yourself. You pick one and you stay with it. Nobody cycles through 6 descriptions of who they are. Okay? That is not a man telling you who he is. That is a writer reaching for a different phrase every time so the page does not repeat itself. Classic reading for story. Your earth, you Orleans, your city, New Orleans, your earthly home, you people, esteemed immortal, same behavior. We will not say the same thing twice. It's classic writing. And then at the very end, watch the language change on him completely. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. Thou wilt, thee. It is not anywhere. That's not anywhere else in the letter. He has written the whole thing in plain 1919 English. In the last sentence, he reaches for a Bible voice because he wants the closing to sound really important. This is composition. It's not recall. And there is a joke in it. His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph. Francis Joseph was the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. He died in 1916. He was the enemy and the war had just ended. That is a wartime gag. That is a man in 1919 who reads the newspaper making a joke he expects other newspaper readers to get. A demon out of hell does not have a punchline about a dead Austrian emperor. Now the part that really settles it for me. There's no emotion in this letter, none. Here is a man describing an axe besmeared with blood and brains. And here's how he describes himself in the same document. I am very fond of jazz music. I am cold and crave the warmth of a native artist. I take no offense. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. Very fond, no offense, reasonable, he's cold and wants to go home. Those are preferences. Those are comforts. That is a man telling you his tastes. I've read letters from people who did horrible things. There is always something underneath it. Rage, contempt, somebody justifying himself, somebody who needs you to understand why. There's none of that in here. The gore is decorative and the feelings are domestic. This whole thing is a costume. Plain and simple. Now, go looking for a time, okay? Because this is the one that does it completely. There's a time in that letter, exactly one. And it is the most famous line in the whole document. At 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night. This is an appointment. There's something that has not happened yet. Now go find me a time for something he did. Okay? It's not in there. There's no night. There's no date. There's no last May. No. The woman on such and such street. Nothing. Yesterday, whatever. There's no date. Twice he reaches backward, and both times he says the exact same thing. In the past. In the past. That is the vaguest thing a person can say. Memory does not work that way. You have actually done something. You know when you did it. It comes attached to the thing. whether you want it there or not. Last Tuesday, last Thursday, ask anybody to tell you about the worst night of their life. I guarantee they start with when it was, okay? Now, lots of past tense here. Let's take a look at it. They have conducted their investigations as they have in the past. They have been so utterly stupid. The police, all of it is the police. He can tell you all about what they have done. He has got exactly one line in the past tense about himself, and it is a piece of scenery hung off the end of a sentence. Here it is. He whom I have sent below to keep me company. No name, no night, no street. No victims in there. He has precise time for something he has not done, okay? And not one single time for anything he has. That is not a man remembering, that is a man scheduling. Okay? And here's a test I would apply to any letter like this. Does the writer know something only the man who did it could know? Okay? That is it. That's the whole test. One detail from inside one of those houses, one of those scenes that had not been in the newspaper. I'd go through it line by line. It is not there. Not one scene, not one victim by name, not the panel out of the door, not the chisel, not the axe left behind, nothing about a single thing that happened in one of those rooms. Okay? Everything in that letter, anybody in New Orleans could have read in the paper that week. So, we'll say it again. And now you have seen the document I am saying we're basically talking about and breaking apart. The writer is not reporting anything he did. He is building a character and asking a newspaper to run it, which means the question was never who wrote it. The question is who wanted it printed. And then there's the date, which almost nobody reads. He did not name a night, he named a feast day. 15 minutes past midnight, Tuesday night. Go look at what that actually is. Everybody calls that the night of March the 18th, and I called it that myself back at the start. But 15 minutes past midnight is not the 18th anymore. That is the first quarter hour of March the 19th, St. Joseph's Day. And in 1919 New Orleans, that was not a small thing. That was the biggest holy day of the year for the Italian and Sicilian community in that city. Excuse me. Altars built in the front rooms, tables of food, doors standing open, families up half the night, going house to house, visiting. Now, set that against the victim list. Almost every one of them, Sicilian or Italian grocers. Whoever wrote that letter named the one night of the year when the exact community being hunted would already be awake, lit up, and open. Now, I'll be straight about what that does and does not get us, because it matters. It does not tell you who wrote it, not even close. Every soul in that city knew what March the 19th was. A newspaper man knew it, a promoter knew it, and a 9-year-old child knew it. But it kills the same small version of this story. He was not a man who happened to like jazz. He was not picking a Tuesday out of a hat. And it runs the same direction as everything else in this file. A man who spends 10 months keeping people asleep does not choose the one night of the year those people are awake. It just doesn't. That date was not chosen to kill on. It was chosen to be watched on. And I told you back in Gretna to hold on to a name. When Rosie finally told the truth, she said St. Joseph came to her in a dream and told her she had to do it. And here is the letter, a year and a half earlier, picking St. Joseph's Day out of the whole calendar. Now, I'm not going to stand here and make that supernatural because it isn't. It is the opposite. It tells you exactly how deep that one saint ran through the daily life of those people. He is the name a terrified woman reaches for when she has to find the courage to undo the worst thing she ever did. And he is the name somebody picked when they wanted the whole community sitting up and watching. Same scene, 2 people using him. Neither one of them was the man coming through the back door. So, who was that letter for? Start with the obvious one. That paper had every commercial reason on earth to run it. Absolutely every reason. A letter signed by the monster addressed to the editor by name, naming a date and the whole city would sit up for. You do not have to be a cynic to see what that is worth on a newsstand. And then there is this, and I want you to sit with it for us, just for a second. There was sheet music named after him, the mysterious Axeman's Jazz. Don't Scare Me, Papa, written by a local composer by the name of Joseph Davila, published in New Orleans in 1919. On the cover, it was a cartoon lifted straight out of the Times Picayune. And here's the part that stopped me. He did not write it a month later after the dust settled. The archive says he wrote it while he waited for the Axeman that night, while the whole city was sitting up with the phonograph running. So somebody in that city was already selling him before the sun came up. Now hear me carefully, because I am not going to do to this man what Gretna did to the Gidanos. I am not telling you Joseph Davila wrote this letter. There's nothing that says he did. Not a thing. I do not know who wrote it. Nobody does, and I'm not going to name a man because it would make a better ending. After I just spent an hour, telling you what happens when you do that. Here's all I am telling you. The man in those crime scenes had nothing to gain from that letter. Nothing. Cost him the one thing he had spent 10 months building, which was not being noticed. And there were people in that city who had plenty to gain from it. That is not a theory. That is just who benefits. And it is the first question I would ask about on this case. And here is the thing about that night that I want you to hold on to, because it is true. And it is the strangest fact in this entire file. The whole city played music into the dark because a letter told them to. Terrified people in their own front rooms at midnight doing what the monster asked. And nothing came. And that proves nothing at all. He had already gone months between attacks before. That was not unusual for him. But you can see how it works, can't you? Think about it. That is how a man becomes a demon, not because anybody ever saw a demon, because the story was better than the truth. And the truth in this case file was never coming. All right, let's close that loop on the sidewalk, the chalk sidewalk about Mrs. Maggio. What it really said was Mrs. Maggio was going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. Police at the time believed it was Mrs. Tony Sciambra. I think I said that right. And she was attacked in 1912, 6 years before the Maggio case. Same city, same community, same Italian grocers. So whoever chalked that sidewalk was pointing backwards. Okay, back at the 1910, 1911, and 1912 cases. That message was written in what the detective described as a schoolboy's hand. It was found and blocked from the store, not in the front door. And plenty of people at the time thought it was a hoax. Somebody who knew the local gossip writing on the sidewalk to frighten people. I can't prove it wasn't. But if it wasn't, then this man did not start in 1918. And here is another oddity of this case. The 2 detectives who found that message were Theodore Obitz and Harry Dodson. Obitz was put in charge of the investigation. Before this case went anywhere, Obitz was shot and killed. Right? The department went looking for the man who shot him, and they shot 2 men dead. Both had nothing to do with it. Both misidentified. Nobody was ever charged for that. Now, before we get to Gretna, let's settle the one thing people always argue about in this case. Was the man in Iowa the man in New Orleans? Start with the MO, because that is the part everybody points at, the axe. Both men used an axe. Both of them used the one they found at the house. That is the part that means the least, because a man can change his tool. He cannot change the thing he came for. So we have to look at the signature. First, the survivors. In the Midwest, it is a whole house every soul in them. 14 years of it, and nobody was left alive, ever. Now in New Orleans, Crudy lived, both Risottos lived, Mary Davy lived, Axeman lived, Rosie and Charlie both lived. Now he walked past living witnesses over and over. That is not a man who failed 6 times. That is a different need. Second, what he came for. In the Midwest, we were staging after the killing. Covered mirrors, covered faces, documented deviance. Okay? That is why he went through those doors. It appears on every scene along that railroad. 10 years of New Orleans, and it never appears. No scene staging or deviant acts, not once. Third, the community. The Midwest man has no city and no community. No ground he ever worked twice. A traveler with no map. New Orleans has exactly 1 city, Italian grocers. 2 animals, different appetites. And that is not my opinion. That is what the scenes say. And the scenes are the only witness in this case we can truly rely on. Now, 20 years before this case even occurred, Fall River, Massachusetts, what did we have? Lizzie Borden. The song says she used an axe. She was never found guilty. The actual weapon was a hatchet. Just wanted to leave you with that thought. At the top of this, before I took you anywhere, I made you 4 promises. I want to close every one of them out loud so you can hold me to it. 1, I told you the most famous piece of evidence in this case is a hoax, and I would take it apart line by line. I did that. Okay? Now, this letter asked to be published in its own last sentence. It hedges when it should be certain. It calls the police stupid and wise in the same paragraph. It calls itself 6 different things because a writer will not repeat a phrase. It has a precise time for something that had not happened yet, and not one time for anything that had, or name, or location. And it does not contain a single fact that was not already well known within the newspapers, if you read it. That is not a man reporting what he did. That is a man building a character and asking a newspaper to run it. 2, I told you that you have been sold a picture of a man crawling through a hole in a door. And that never happened. It never happened. Those panels came out small, cut low, right beside the lock. And the chisel got left on the floor inside. Nobody crawled through anything. A hand went through and turned the bolt. And I told you the scenes would tell you what he did for a living. They did. Knew how to work a tool. That is a burglar's work. Whatever else the Axeman was, he was a burglar first. And he was a burglar for years before anybody died. 3, I told you people will hand you Villisca and tell you it is the same man, and I could show you it is not by looking at the scenes and examining them, right? You just watch me do it. Talk about survivors, what he came for, the grounds, going back twice, the city of New Orleans, and the MO. That everybody leans on is the one thing a man is free to change, okay? 4, I told you 2 innocent men went to prison and that it happened for the same reason this case was never solved. Not because one caused the other, because it was the same habit both times. Somebody decided who it was and then went looking for a person who fit their belief. That convicts the wrong man, and it means nobody is reading the scene that would have found the right one. Here is the count. Iowa put a man in front of 2 grand juries on a grudge and a hunch and indicted a preacher as an afterthought. The New Orleans shot 2 men dead over obits on a bad identification and charged nobody. Probably why they didn't want to work with Gretna, or Gretna didn't want to work with them. And Gretna pretty much harassed their witness, put her in jail until she signed the paper saying who did it. Her husband got on the stand and told them they weren't the ones that did it, but yet they sentenced the 17-year-old boy to hang. Right? And 4 times, same failure every time. Somebody decided who it was and then went looking for a person to say it out loud. Different states, different decades, same result every single time. This is not a coincidence. So, here's why I come out. 3 rulings, and I'll give them to you straight, okay? On the offender, the suspect. It's unsolved. No suspect can be responsibly named. Not Mumfre, not anybody. And anybody who tells you this, one is closed, it's going past the evidence, okay? And they have been doing pretty much that for a century, okay? Can't get past the evidence here. On the monster, not supported. The letter is a hoax and probably not even the killer's hoax. And on what actually failed, the testimony. This investigation was not beaten by a clever man. It was beaten by what it was willing to accept as evidence. Vague statements taken from injured people in bad conditions and one identification pulled out of a grieving mother in a jail cell? Horrible. Which is the only thing this case ever produced that a jury would act on. And it was wrong. In so many ways it was wrong. The Axeman was never identified, but 2 men were convicted, and one of them was a 17-year-old boy sentenced to hang on the word of a witness who had seen nothing at all. Okay, after Pepitone, it just stops. No arrest, no trial, no confession. That really holds. It ends in silence the same way it started. So think on this before you close the file. Everything that would actually prove any of it is missing, which leaves a version of this where the thing that came through those back doors never got chased out of that city at all, okay? He set that chisel down. He kept living next door to somebody. He sat across from people at church. He bought his groceries off the same street as every name on that list. He got old and he died probably in a bed at home with his family around him. And nobody ever came looking again because the city already had an ending it liked a lot better than the one that might be true. That's just sad. That is the file. It is not solved. It is not closed. People ask me, what would you do? People ask me, what would do something like this? What type of person comes into a house at night, walks past the money, walks past everything, and goes for the people in the bed? The honest answer is the one nobody wants to hear. A man would. Men do it all the time. And that is worse than a demon, because a demon you can close a file on. A demon is not your neighbor. A demon does not nod at you on the sidewalk or say good morning, good night. 2 men in Gretna went to prison because somebody decided they had found them. That is the whole lesson in this file, and it cuts both ways. At the investigators who names a man too early, okay, and at me if I do it here. Just because it would, if I do it here just because it would make a better ending, I'm not going to do that. Read the room before you name the man. Read the scene. That was the job in 1919. It's still a job today. And whatever came through those doors, nobody ever put a name on it. Nobody ever put hands on it. And it died of old age with a family that never knew who he was. The sad part is the 12-year-old girl in that house in Iowa, they never solved that one either. We owe her. And we owe all these families in New Orleans. And we owe those 2 men in Gretna. We can do better. Now, eyes up, heads up, on a swivel. This file is not closed. Case file 001 stays open, unsolved, cold case. I'm Brian Montier. This is the Montier Files. Be safe.